Hello everybody in HDFS 317. I'm Susan Hepburn, your professor, and I wanted to provide for you a brief filmed presentation here about what educational eligibility categories are, but most importantly, how to prepare you for your semester-long project. So as you probably noticed when you looked at the assignments, part of what you're being asked to do in this very beginning is to identify a developmental condition that emerges in early childhood that you're really interested in. And you're going to explore that condition in lots of structured ways through assignments and discussions with your colleagues across the semester. Now, one part of this assignment, which I'll go into in a moment in a little bit more detail, is not only that you identify the condition, such as Down syndrome or autism spectrum disorder or fetal alcohol syndrome, but you're also going to consider of all of the educational eligibility categories that are listed in IDEA, which as you recall is the federal law that oversees who has eligibility for special education services in our country. You're going to look through those categories and think to yourself, what are three possible educational eligibility categories that a particular child with the condition you've chosen might be able to receive special ed services. So within the IDEA guidelines, the federal government lays out 13 conditions and gives definitions of those conditions and says to every state, if you're working with a child under the age of 3 with one of these conditions, that child has the right to free early intervention. It's usually about an hour a week with somebody from the state until they are about 3 years of age. For children who are older than 3 and continue to present with a developmental condition, such as the ones in your assignment, they are eligible to receive special education services within the school system through the age of 22 if at every 3-year point in time they are found to continue to present with that particular condition. So the eligibility system that's built into the federal IDEA law is then brought down to each state. And each state is responsible to follow the federal law. However, each state is able to define the conditions that they will serve and give more specifics about who's eligible and who isn't. So what this means is even though we have a federal system under IDEA that says that people are eligible for special ed, states have a lot of room on how they define that. So some states provide more services than others. And that becomes kind of a tricky thing for families because most of us don't know the special education law in the states within which we live. And so it would require a parent to actually go to the Department of Education website for their state to try to understand what eligibilities allow a child for these free and specialized services. So a lot of what I do as a psychologist who works with the Department of Education here in Colorado is that we go around the state and we teach families and school personnel about the educational identification process, which is what allows us to evaluate a child and ask, does the child have a disability as defined by the IDEA, our federal guidance, and by our state? And if so, what supports and services does that child need in order to thrive? So the IDEA eligibility criteria for infants and toddlers, in other words, people who are 3 years of age or younger, are listed here on this slide. And they're pretty broad. Basically, any young child who's experiencing a delay in development as measured by specific tools that we'll talk about in Chapter 3. Those areas of development that allow a child access for intervention are pretty broad as well, which is great. So delays in cognitive development, in physical or motor development, in communication, in social and emotional development, or in their overall adaptive skills and independence would all help them be eligible for additional supports. In addition, if a child has a diagnosed condition, either physical or mental, that has what the law describes as a high probability of resulting in a developmental delay, that child gets automatic access to early intervention and specialized education. So an example here would be Down syndrome. So the moment a baby is born and identified as having Down syndrome, early intervention services kick in, and that family can have support from the state, from everything from nursing care to specialized assistance in working on oral motor development, perhaps through someone with speech language expertise, maybe an OT, a PT, or an early childhood interventionist. So there are many ways to get into the early intervention system, and then the hope is that as those children turn 3, some of them will no longer present with a developmental delay that is significant enough to warrant intervention in the school years. In particular, young children who haven't had enough social experience or haven't been able to be in the care of a consistent and compassionate and great caregiver, those children often respond really well to environmental supports and interventions. And while they may have looked really behind when they were younger because their environment was not very enriched, as they received more intervention, they no longer qualified as a child with a significant delay. And the hope is they can now be served through the school system without additional modifications or supports. So children who look delayed at younger years but grow out of it are usually no longer in the system moving forward. But children who have a genetic disorder that's associated with learning difficulties or behavioral or mental health concerns are likely to need to be evaluated throughout their time in the school district to see if the educational supports that are available to every child are sufficient to help them learn and grow. And if a child is not able to access an appropriate education through the regular procedures, then that child is referred for an eligibility evaluation where an entire team of school providers, usually includes teachers, school psychologists, counselors, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, could be learning specialists, a whole host of folks are going to get involved and work with the family to do a thorough assessment to try to determine, does the child have a disability at this time, to describe what that profile is like, and then to connect the child's characteristics to specific interventions that could be helpful. Now, it's important to keep in mind that IDEA is very specific about an important thing, which is you cannot limit a child's access to particular educational programs based on their eligibility category. So what I mean by that is that lawmakers didn't want everybody in a school system to just decide if the child has autism, they go into this autism class. That's actually against the law. The idea behind IDEA is to take on an individualized approach, thoroughly evaluate the child, and describe that child with lots of quantitative assessment data as well as qualitative observations. And then the team creates with the parent a series of ideas around, gosh, what kind of modifications do we need for this child? What sort of supports are necessary for this child to be able to benefit from their education? Now, in the federal law, the expectation is that enough modifications are provided so that any child has access to a free and appropriate education, or FAPE, Free and Appropriate Program for Education. That doesn't mean that the educational modifications or things that are being done are the gold standard or the best in the world or the optimal program. The school is actually not legally responsible to do the best possible job to educate a child. They are actually held to a legal standard of a free and appropriate education. In other words, given the resources that the school has, the amount of time with the child, and the significance of the child's challenges, what is a realistic set of plans and procedures to continue to foster development on the part of the child. So the school is legally responsible to promote development across the lifespan for the students that they serve, but there are often legal battles in court where the family might want a program that the court considers to be optimal programming, which schools are not actually required to do. They're required to provide a free and appropriate education. So those of us who work in the schools, we do our best to make our standard of care the best it can possibly be, and we work really hard with families and team members to make sure that we are sharing information with each other about each learner and adjusting our supports as the learner grows and develops. We'll talk about these things throughout this course, but I wanted to have this information out there for you, because parents will often hear certain words for conditions or characteristics their children have from the medical community, like from a pediatrician or a psychologist like myself. And then they go into the school system and discover that those very same conditions need to now be evaluated again, because the school is responsible not only to identify the disability, but to demonstrate that the child can't access current educational programming without modifications. We call that second part of the question the impact question. So the disability doesn't automatically get you access to special education services unless the child's individual education team, which is comprised of school professionals and the parent, can make a strong case that the child experiences adverse impact because of their disability, and they're not able to access their educational opportunities because of this condition. So, for example, I know many individuals with autism spectrum disorders who received a lot of special education supports under the educational eligibility category of autism in their public school system. And then when they got to the high school years, they were functioning so well that while they still had autism, I would still give the diagnosis. They're still learning differently and functioning differently, but they're doing really well with their own style. Perhaps they're no longer needing additional modifications or supports to be successful in school. Those students may not meet the eligibility requirement for the school to provide special ed. So a person could have a disorder that the clinical world acknowledges, but not need special ed assistance, which means they wouldn't go through, or they might go through the testing, but they wouldn't receive intervention through the school district because they would not be able to meet criteria for the school's eligibility category. So it can be very confusing to parents who automatically assume that if a child has a medical condition and they had early intervention services, that they're going to be able to continue those throughout the school years. And the important thing to know is that within public schools, every 3 years, we reevaluate whether or not a child has a disability and whether or not that disability is impacting their ability to access their education. If they do have a disability and it has an adverse impact on their schooling, then there can be modifications, perhaps an IEP or perhaps a 504, but an individualized plan that provides the support they need to succeed at school. So please keep that in mind as you look through your learning materials for this module. Now let's go into a really brief overview. I just want to let you know what our semester-long assignment is going to be like, and I'll be referring you to many of the materials that you have in Canvas, which are going to go into a whole lot more detail on this assignment. So this was really, to be honest with you, the highlight of the course when we did it last spring in a live way. And so we are now modifying this semester-long project for online delivery, and you all are going to be able to give me some feedback on whether or not this was a useful learning opportunity for you. I sure hope it will be as fruitful for you all online as it was for the students where we did it live. So we're going to refer to this project as the Developmental Conditions of Childhood project. And as you'll see in Canvas, it has 6 assignments that are connected to it, and they occur across the semester. Just about each assignment is accompanied by a discussion that will be highly structured by us, and there are specific instructions in each of these discussions if you'd like to learn more. But the idea behind these discussions is to give you some contact with your colleagues as you're preparing the next assignment. So for the first 2 discussions, you're going to be with the same small group of people, 4 to 6 people total, and you'll have kind of a mission about sharing information with each other to help each other complete your projects on your conditions. In future discussion groups, we're going to change it up. And you may be talking with people who are working in a condition that overlaps slightly with yours or is entirely different. Our hope is to not only develop some discussions amongst you about the conditions themselves, but help you share practical input on where to find information or how to approach some of the things you might be wrestling with. So please pay attention to when the discussions open and when they close. And in general, while we grade the discussions after the deadline, we do hope that you'll do your initial post towards the beginning of the week, Mondays ideally, perhaps Tuesday, but that allows others to have some time to comment on what you've put up, and those final discussions are usually ending on a Friday. Many times our discussions begin when you've handed in an assignment to help you get ready for the next one. So for example, the first of 6 parts of your semester-long assignment is in Module 2, and it'll be due next week by September 9th. And in this assignment, your goal is to look through a list that we've posted of developmental disabilities that emerge during childhood and choose one that you're interested in. And then look at the list of educational eligibility categories, which is at the bottom of that very same document, and think through, if the child has this condition, for what I know about it, what might the child be eligible for in special ed? There usually are up to 3 categories in this educational eligibility system that might apply. So a child with Down syndrome, for example, would most likely be served under an intellectual disability. But a child with Down syndrome, if they also met criteria for an autism spectrum disorder, the educational team could decide, wow, it's the autism symptoms that are really getting in the way of this student's learning. So even though he has Down syndrome, it's his autism that we think is the primary driver. We're going to want to pull interventions from the autism literature to help this student. Then the primary eligibility might be autism, the secondary might be intellectual disability. And then a third possibility is a child with Down syndrome could have significant health problems, and there is an additional eligibility called other health impaired, which could be brought to bear if it's the child's physical health challenges that are making it hardest to participate. Now, the reason I'm asking you to identify 3 that are possible is to just help us think more broadly about how the medical world defines conditions in one way, and the educational world is going to define them in a different way. So as you do your readings, you're going to learn about the medical world's diagnostic system. You're going to learn about the 0 to 3 diagnostic system, which is for early intervention, and you're going to learn about the educational system. They use different words and languages, and it's confusing to families, and as a professional, you'll need to be able to talk to them about these things. So in your very first assignment, you're simply choosing a condition you want to really delve into across the semester and identifying 3 possible educational eligibility categories you could imagine a person with this condition might be served under. Then you'll participate in discussion number 2, where you're going to have a specific mission about sharing some of your sources as you are now going to prepare for your first assignment, which is the fact sheet assignment. So you're going to identify your condition by the 9th, and then we'd like to see the discussion occur over that week, and we will close it by midnight on the 16th. So take a look at that discussion. You will notice we've given specific guidelines as to what to put in initial posts, and then we try to give specifics about what you might comment upon in your responses. So you're not limited to these things, they're just suggestions from us if you're not really sure how to proceed. So, as I mentioned, your first written assignment, which is worth about 50 points, I believe, is the fact sheet assignment. And the full details for this are listed in Canvas. We'll also always try to provide you with some examples. In the fact sheet assignment, you're going to be doing some research to come up with the very specific details about this condition that you would find most relevant to either parents who maybe just learned their kid had this condition, or perhaps an early childhood educator who just learned that in his classroom he's got 2 children with this condition. He needs to now understand, what do we know about this condition, and that's going to inform some of the modifications that will be most helpful for that student. So this assignment is going to be due on September 30th, and the big goal here is to create a fact sheet that can be bullet points, or it can be a narrative. It should be no more than 2 pages, and it should really be written in a parent-friendly or teacher-friendly way so that a layperson can easily understand this. So here we want to try to practice writing at about an 8th grade level. So I've included ways to access the readability statistics of a document that you're writing and try really hard to create a fact sheet, 1 to 2 pages, that goes into the specific details that we provide to you throughout the guidance, and do it in a way that a parent or a teacher could look at that fact sheet and really have a better idea of what this condition is all about. Now, while we do want you to use APA format, we do want you to cite the sources that you've used to inform your fact sheet. Those citations can go on a 3rd page if you don't have room, or they can go at the bottom of your page. The other thing that we want you to think about is that we don't expect you all to be like graphic design artists. However, many of you are really talented in this area. It is completely up to you how visually enhanced you want your document to be. Our grades are going to be primarily on the content, but when you create a document that is visually appealing and has characteristics that sort of draw the reader in, that does help people understand it more. So while you're not required to be a graphic artist and visuals are completely optional, if you do use them, they're likely to enhance your presentation, probably earn a point or 2. But we're going to grade you mostly on what you've learned from the literature and what you're synthesizing and presenting in your own words to these families or colleagues. That fact sheet assignment will be posted by September 30th, which then opens up our next discussion, where you are going to share your fact sheets with each other and give each other a little feedback, ask questions of each other, and basically promote more learning about these conditions. That discussion will go on until October 7th. Part of that discussion can also inform your next written assignment, because now we've given you specific details in assignment 7.5, which will be due October 14th, on how to create a resource list for use by that early childhood educator or those parents. So we go into 6 different types of resources we'd like you to try to find and basically put together in a document in APA format. As we talk through this project, what you might be anticipating is by the end of this semester, we're going to have collected so much helpful information about these conditions, and we're going to make everybody's documents available to everybody. So say next year you're an early childhood teacher and you get a child with Williams syndrome in your class. I hope you would pull up the project that one of your colleagues did on Williams syndrome and immediately have at your fingertips some really useful information. So as you're preparing these documents, think about them not just as school assignments, but think of them as hopefully resources that you and your colleagues can pull on in the years to come. After you complete your resource assignments, we then open up the next discussion, which moves into how do we find evidence-based interventions that would be appropriate for somebody with this condition. And this is where you have a lot of latitude as a professional based on the areas that you're most interested in focusing on. So say, for example, you choose something like a child is exposed to trauma due to family violence. And you look in the literature and you discover that trauma-informed family therapy is strongly recommended, particularly if a child is under the age of 5. You might decide to choose that type of intervention, trauma-focused family therapy, to include in your brief summary of early interventions you'd recommend, which is your next writing assignment. In this discussion, you'll be interacting with a group of colleagues, 4 to 6, really small group, and sharing ideas about how do we think about a condition and what kinds of intervention could be useful. I am only asking you to identify 2 interventions that would be appropriate for the next assignment. So while we might have in mind 15 things we'd want to do, I'm going to ask you to research what is the evidence base of 2 of the interventions that you've seen mentioned as potentially relevant for the population. And this discussion gives you the chance to share ideas with your colleagues about that. That early childhood practice brief is your last written assignment in this class, and it has very specific details, even a paragraph by paragraph outline that's recommended that will guide you through what we're looking for in this brief summary or synthesis of 2 interventions that could serve children well. We want you to look at evidence-based sources that back up this intervention. We want you to be able to cite your sources in APA format, and it's really important that you go to peer-reviewed, credible sources when you're evaluating the evidence. That written assignment will be due in late October, specifically October 28th. Followed by a discussion that will be open for about 2 weeks, which is going to allow you to have a dialogue with a group of your colleagues about connecting interventions to conditions and kind of pulling it all together. But it's also a way to connect with each other as you prepare for your final assignment in this class, which is due on November 28th, and that is a 5-minute video presentation that you're going to record just like I'm doing now. It could be in a PowerPoint format like this, or you could just turn on your webcam and talk into it. You could get out your phone and talk into it. We'll give you more help and support and how to make a video later on. For today, what I want you to know is that you don't need to write a PowerPoint presentation. You don't need to create anything other than the 3 documents you've done: the fact sheet, the resource list, and the early childhood brief. You're going to print those out and have those nearby. The goal in these 5-minute presentations is to think of yourself as like a consultant for a school district. And the school has asked you, can you give us a brief summary of what we know about this condition and how we might be able to help this kid who's going to be coming to our school who has this condition, and we just want to know more. So you are going to be video recording as if you are talking to a team of colleagues, and it might even include a parent in the room who's just learned that her son has this condition. So you're going to approach it as an informal presentation. It's not a lecture. It's not a formal thing with a PowerPoint. It's you sitting down and saying, oh, you'd like to know more about Williams syndrome? All right, well, here's 3 documents, and I'll post them so you can read them later. But here's what I learned about Williams syndrome. You start with your fact sheet, move into a couple of resources that might be useful, and then highlight a bit from your intervention brief. So you might think, 5 minutes, that's so short. We did that on purpose. I want you to practice professionally communicating without a lot of written notes, without a lot of practice, to just get there and share what you know. By the time you're making this video, you will have been talking and writing and researching this condition for a pretty long time. And so we don't expect perfect. It's okay if you stumble or you need to find a word. Just be real and use it as an opportunity to share what you've learned with a group of professionals. So that is what we're looking for that last project. And then what we will do, as we did last year when people gave these kind of 5-minute things in a poster session, where we had them live standing around and people would rotate from speaker to speaker, kind of like speed dating. That's sort of the tone. It's very fast, but it's a lot of content. What we are going to do is ask each of you to review 4 presentations, and we'll send you an assignment list. You'll watch those 5-minute videos and you will give anonymous feedback to the presenter. And we want that feedback to be really positive and really encouraging. And we're going to pull from what we learned about teaming and collaborating in Chapter 10 to make sure that our feedback has a professional tone. The person you're giving the feedback to will not know who is providing it. Our teaching team will gather up all of the feedback. We will put it together in a de-identified summary for each speaker. So by the end of the semester, when we give out your final grades, you'll receive a document from us that is a summary of the feedback from your colleagues and your instructors as we reviewed your video presentations. So That's the story. We've tried to come up with a project that will allow you to follow your interests, and we also want you to be able to apply what we're talking about in class to something sort of real world. My hope really is that each of you will develop a repository of learning materials from your peers that you can use in the future. So as you are working on your assignments, rely on each other. You're allowed to take the feedback and improve a document if you want to and you have the time, but it's also okay to share your work as is. We're really just trying to support each other's learning. There's so much to learn about the different ways that child development can be impacted by things, and I want to use this as an opportunity to tap the expertise and the experience we also have in your cohort of students, which really includes a lot of people with some fantastic experiences in child development. So thank you for your time. We will talk more about each assignment along the way. Just wanted you to have a sense of what this is about, particularly as you're going to identify your conditions for next week's class. Thanks very much and have a wonderful long weekend.